Welcome to Veritate with your host, Johnny Mack, a podcast that will dive deep into the pursuit of truth in a world filled with noise, confusion, and fleeting opinions. We will seek to uncover the eternal, unshakable truths that shape our lives and our beliefs, from faith and philosophy to history and culture. We'll explore the questions that matter, challenge the answers we've been given, and seek the wisdom that has stood the test of time. So join Johnny Mack in this journey to discover what's real, what's right, and what's true.
Welcome back once again to Veritate, and I'm your host, Johnny Mack. Now, if you've been with me thus far through the series, you already know I'm not doing comparative religion like a professor would do it. And I'm not trying to sound smart. I'm just trying to be honest about what I did, what I read, what I believed, and then finally what broke through. And so I'm not walking you through this in the order that a textbook would pick. I'm walking you through it in the order that I lived it. And the reason that matters is because the order explains the pressure that I felt. It explains why certain ideas hit me the way that it did. It explains why some claims felt plausible, even if later on they collapsed. So I did not begin my research with Islam. I lived it. I didn't begin with Judaism. I studied that afterwards. So when I began with Taoism, what I was looking for at the time is I was looking for something that was ancient, that claimed wisdom without demanding faith. And so Taoism presented itself like that. And so it felt like it might offer clarity without God, and that appealed to the atheist in me because I wanted a system that could explain life without asking me to submit to a divine voice. And I wanted to find out if peace could be built on observation alone. And then I moved on, and I kept moving because these questions did not go away. And I've kept asking these same four questions because they're the only questions that really matter when everything else gets stripped away. Who is God? Who is man? What went wrong? How is it fixed? And see, those questions don't care about what your background is. They don't even care if you were raised religious or if you were raised skeptical or you were raised a practical atheist like myself. They don't care if you're angry at religion. They don't care if you're grateful for it. They just keep pressing because life keeps pressing. And then you get older and you watch people suffer. You watch people die. You watch people betray each other. You watch people sacrifice for each other. And you see beauty and you see horror. And you cannot live long without needing answers to that. And so by the time that I arrived at Buddhism, I was already trained by this because I had learned that every system has a sales pitch. Some of them will sell you certainty. Some of them will sell you identity. Some sell you community. Some sell you escape. But I did not want a sales pitch. I wanted the truth. And I have to admit this, Buddhism appealed to my atheism more than what most of these others had touched on up to that point. And here's why. At the time, I didn't believe in God. I didn't believe in a personal God. I didn't believe in a creator, not a judge. I was operating with the assumption that the universe exists without intention. And I assumed that morality is mostly just social pressure. I assumed that meaning is something that we manufacture and not something that we receive. So when I encountered religions that revolved around God, law, judgment, obedience, and revelation, I could study them, but they felt like they were speaking a language that I did not accept. And even if I could admire their structure, I couldn't enter the house because the foundation was God, and I just believed that God was not there. So now Buddhism did something completely different. Buddhism didn't begin by telling me who God is and what God demands. It began by telling the truth about suffering. And that alone made it feel more honest to an atheist mind because you don't need faith to notice suffering. You don't need revelation to notice that people crave, they cling onto things, they have fear, they get older, they lose, and they die. And you don't need theology to notice that desire can enslave you. So Buddhism started where everyone starts, whether they admit it or not. Pain exists, loss exists, fear exists, death exists. And then you have the Buddha himself. Now, Buddha doesn't claim to be God, and he doesn't claim that a creator spoke through him either. He doesn't claim revelation in a way that prophets do. He just presents himself as a man who saw clearly, and he woke up and he taught a path. And that sounded plausible. It sounded like a disciplined philosopher, not a divine messenger of any way, and that's exactly why it was attractive to me. Because Atheism tries to live in a world without any judge above it. But it still has to explain why people suffer. It still has to explain why we fear death. It has to explain why you can't control your thoughts. It still has to explain why your wants control you. Now, atheism usually offers distraction, or sometimes cynicism, or sometimes self-help, but Buddhism offered something that was more structured because it offered a diagnosis and it offered a method. So it felt more like atheism with a backbone, so to speak. It was less worship, more practice, less prayer, more training, less doctrine, more discipline, and that's why it caught me. And so I also have to be honest here about text because people like to derail here. When I studied Buddhism, I did not have the full library of the Buddha's writings because Buddhism in and of itself is not one book. It's not even one bookshelf. It is a massive body of text across centuries, across languages and schools. And if you wanted to do it in the most exhaustive way possible, you would have to have a large library just to hold all of the material, then let alone have the time to read all of it. And of course, I didn't have all of that. So what I had was a compilation. Basically, it was a collected set of the teachings that are presented as the core of Buddhism for just a normal reader. And that's enough for the kind of examination that I'm doing here. And the reason why is because Buddhism doesn't rest on any claim that God revealed this, and therefore you have to accept it. It rests on the claim that this is true because it describes suffering accurately, and it works in practice. So I'm not going to hide behind the size of the library, and I'm also not going to be intimidated by that either. If the central claim cannot answer the questions, then the footnotes don't save it. If the heart of the system can't weigh reality, then the more pages you get don't change that. I have to be clear about what I mean by reality. I'm not talking about anxiety or personal disappointment or stress at work. Reality includes love, loyalty, sacrifice, hatred, cruelty, courage, and evil. Because some men give their lives for each other. That is real. And some men choose to murder the innocent, and that too is real. And some suffering does come from desire, and some suffering comes from doing what is right. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to test Buddhism the same way we've tested everything else. We're going to ask the questions, and we're going to force straight answers. We have to see what holds and what collapses. And so where we always begin is, who is God? And Buddhism makes a move right there at the very start that you cannot miss. Buddhism doesn't begin with God. It begins with suffering. So that alone would explain why it appealed to my atheism. And at the time, I didn't believe in a creator, so any system that starts with it, here's who God is and here's what he demands, I already felt like it assumed the very thing I rejected. And Buddhism doesn't make this demand. But I'm going to have to say this carefully here because people hear Buddhism doesn't begin with God and then they assume that Buddhism is just atheism with incense. And that's not accurate either. Buddhism doesn't argue like a modern atheist does because it doesn't try to disprove God. It just does something more subtle. It treats the question as unnecessary for the problem it wants to solve. In other words, look, Buddhism doesn't shout out, there is no God. It just shrugs its shoulders and says, that question's not going to help you in suffering. And so look, that matters too because that's not a side detail. That shapes the entire system of Buddhism. And Buddhism also did not appear out of nowhere either. It came from a world that had already been saturated with the Hindu ideas that we discussed last week. So when I had studied Hinduism, I saw this universe that was thick with gods. It had rituals. It had cycles. It had these metaphysical claims. I saw karma. I saw rebirth. I saw liberation as a goal and this constant push towards escaping this cycle of suffering and illusion. But Hinduism gave many answers, but it produced endless branches as well, because one text would point one direction, another text would point to another direction, and you would always find another God, another path, another explanation. And so it felt endless. And so now Buddhism arrives inside that same cultural idea, but it does something that felt to me like a purification, if that makes sense, because it keeps several of the inherited concepts like karma and rebirth, but then it refuses to ground them in the creator or a God. It refuses to multiply gods the way that Hinduism did. And it doesn't treat worship as though it's central, And it also refuses to treat revelation as the foundation of it. The Buddha, he never presents himself as God. Siddhartha Gautama does not say, I created the universe. He doesn't say, I am the judge. He doesn't say, God spoke through me. He speaks like a man who claims to have awakened and that he saw reality clearly and that he's found a path that works. So that's why the size of the Buddhist library doesn't intimidate me the way other systems do, because Buddhism doesn't hinge on these are the exact revealed words of God. It hinges on this describes suffering accurately and this path leads out of it. So that claim invites testing, and it invites practice, and it invites verification. And so it doesn't begin by commanding any belief. So when you ask that first question, who is God? Buddhism almost gives you an answer that sounds like silence. But that's actually a decision, because Buddhism does not provide a creator. It doesn't place a personal God above the world who made it, that sustains it and judges it. It doesn't even center reality on a divine will. In many presentations of Buddhism, questions about the origin of the universe, they get treated as though they're distractions. And certainly not because the Buddha couldn't think deeply, but because he focused on the immediate human problem. That suffering exists, that desire exists, that attachment exists. And so the path out matters more than any of the metaphysical speculation, so to speak. So some later forms of Buddhism include many spiritual beings. And people can call them gods if they want to, but those beings do not function as God in the way that Judaism or Islam or any of the other religions use the word, because they do not create. They don't stand as any ultimate authority, and they don't judge the world in a final sense. So they exist inside the same structure of the impermanence. They also remain within the cycles. That means Buddhism can allow the existence of powerful beings, but still refuse the category of a creator like God. And so that's where Buddhism and atheism actually overlap in a way that felt very familiar. Because atheism basically says there is no creator. And Buddhism says whether a creator exists or not doesn't matter for liberation. So it's a different logic, but it's the same outcome. And in both of those, you don't live under a personal judge. In both of them, you don't receive moral law from above. In both of them, you have to build your life without expecting revelation to settle the question for you. And so that similarity gave Buddhism an immediate plausibility to my little atheist mind. I didn't have to accept miracles. I didn't have to accept prophecy. I didn't have to accept any divine command. And Buddhism looked like it offered something very practical, almost clinical, in the way that it diagnoses suffering. You just identify the cause, you apply the cure. But here's the cost, though. It's where I begin to feel tension even back then. Because if Buddhism removes God from the center, then it also removes the final anchor for meaning and moral weight and justice. And if no personal God exists, then no one stands above the world to declare this is good and this is evil. Not in any kind of way that binds the human conscience. So Buddhism can talk about wholesome and unwholesome actions. It can talk about compassion. It can talk about harm, but it does so within the framework of consequence and suffering. Not with any sort of framework like obedience to a holy judge. And so that distinction actually matters more than people think it does. A system can tell you don't do this because it increases suffering. And that's a very pragmatic reason. It can even seem though it's wise, but in the same sense, it's not the same as don't do this because it's wrong, and wrongness is real, and you will answer for that. So when you remove God, you also remove the idea that reality itself carries a moral voice. Now, you can still build ethics, but you build them from the ground up, from experiences and consequences and empathy, and maybe that can restrain some evil, but it can also fail to name the deepest evil. That's why Buddhism can feel peaceful and yet also feel incomplete at the same time, because it offers a way to reduce your suffering by changing your relationship to desire. It offers a path of discipline and detachment, clarity of mind, but it doesn't offer a personal God who speaks, that commands, that judges, and redeems. But to be honest, when I first encountered Buddhism, that absence felt like a feature, not like a flaw or anything, because I wanted a system that did not demand faith in God. I just wanted a way to make sense of life without a creator. And Buddhism appeared to give me that. So this is the clean answer to the first question. Buddhism doesn't give you a God, it gives you a path. And it doesn't introduce a creator, it introduces a diagnosis. So there's no call to worship, just a call to detach. That decision sets up everything else we have to ask, especially the next question, who is man? Because when Buddhism answers the question of man, it also doesn't begin with dignity in the way that most religions do. It just begins with the diagnosis. Just an observation. You suffer. Your thoughts race. Your desires pull you. Your emotions, they rise, they fall. Then you age, you get sick. You lose what you love, and then you die. So Buddhism asks a very hard question. And that is, what exactly is the you that suffers? And now here's where Buddhism makes its most radical move, especially in relationship to Hinduism. Because Hinduism, broadly speaking, insists that there is an Atman, there is a true self, there is a soul, there's something enduring that moves through the cycle of rebirth. And liberation in Hindu thought often means realizing your true self and its connection to this ultimate reality. And even when Hinduism gets tangled up in stories of gods and rituals, it still holds on to that center, that there is a self, there is a soul, and there is something permanent behind the shifting surface. And then Buddhism comes out of that world and it says, no. Not only is the self not ultimate, the self is not even what you think it is. So in the core of Buddhist teaching, the permanent self is an illusion. That you experience yourself as a stable identity, but that stability is a kind of mental construction. That it's continuity, not permanence. So who is man? Man is not an immortal soul. Man is not a fixed essence. Man is just a composite, a temporary collection of components that arise and they pass away. And Buddhism often explains this through the idea of aggregates. That what you call a person is made up of changing parts, not a permanent core of anything. It's just body, sensation, perception, mental formation, and then consciousness. And none of those are stable. None of those are permanent. And you can't hold on to any of them. So when you say me, Buddhism says that you're just naming a bundle, not a being. And that is also where Buddhism appealed very strongly to my atheism. Because the atheism, at least the kind that I lived, it had no room for a soul. It had no reason to believe in any enduring self beyond the brain. It taught me to see man as biology, as psychology, and an experience. The self was not sacred, and the self was just a set of patterns. And that self could be explained, it could be conditioned, and it could be reshaped. And Buddhism felt like it shared that realism, but with a little more discipline. It didn't say you're only matter in a crude way. It said, look closely and you will see that the self does not exist the way you assume it does. And if you think about that, it does hit you with kind of a certain force that you're not the same man you were at 10 years old. Your cells change, your opinions change, your emotional reactions change, even your memories change. Yet you still feel like a single identity. You still feel like a single self. And so Buddhism uses that fact to press you. If everything about you changes, then what exactly is permanent? And so Buddhism answers that with nothing. And that sounds very bleak when you first hear it, but Buddhism actually presents that as freedom. Because if the self is an illusion, then a huge amount of suffering comes from defending it, from feeding it, from clinging to it. So all of that pride, the envy, the fear, the resentment, all of it ties back to this self that feels threatened and a future that feels uncertain. And Buddhism would just tell you to stop clinging. Stop defending an identity that's not real. Stop grasping at permanence in the world defined by impermanence. That's not stupid. That's not shallow. That's not even a cheap idea. That can actually feel like relief to somebody who's drowning in anxiety and guilt and fear. Because if the self is less solid than you thought it was, then maybe your pain doesn't have to rule you. But then the problem shows up. And it's a problem that never fully goes away. Because if there is no enduring self, then who's responsible? Buddhism still teaches moral causality through karma, just like Hinduism. That actions matter, that choices matter, that they shape your suffering and the suffering of others. But Buddhism also teaches rebirth in many forms, which then raises the next question. If there's no soul, what continues? And Buddhism answers this with continuity, not identity. The effects of your actions carry forward. The chain continues. One life conditions the next. And not by transferring a soul like a package or anything, but like a causal flow. It's often described as a process lighting another process, that they're connected, but they're not identical. And at the time, that explanation satisfied my mind because it matched atheism again. No soul was needed, just cause and effect. No personal judge needed, just consequences. But the longer I sat with it, I started to feel the tension. Because in real life, moral responsibility depends on you. And it depends on a stable you. Not a perfectly unchanging you, but a real someone. If a man commits evil, we don't say a bundle of aggregates did it. We say he did it. Because we have to hold the person accountable. We assume that a self owns that act. And Buddhism tries to preserve accountability while it dissolves the self. And it creates a strain. Like, it can feel like you're a being that's told two things at once. That you're not a self, but you are responsible. And Buddhism can answer that philosophically. But a lived life keeps pushing back against that. Because love assumes a real someone. Loyalty assumes a real someone. Betrayal assumes a real someone. Even compassion assumes a real someone. So when a person suffers, you don't comfort an abstraction, you comfort a person. So Buddhism's anthropology's view of man has a double edge. It can humble you, it can calm you, it can train you to stop obsessing over the ego, but at the same time, it can also thin out the meaning of what being a person is if you take it all the way. And this is where I began to notice something very important. Buddhism doesn't treat man as though he's fallen. It just treats man as though he's mistaken. That man's not guilty before God because God's not the sinner. Man is not in rebellion against anything because rebellion assumes that there's a lawgiver. Man is just ignorant. Man clings. Man misperceives reality. So the problem is definitely not a corrupted will. The problem's a confused mind. And that leads straight to the next question, because if man's not fallen but mistaken, then what exactly went wrong is going to look very different to what Judaism or Islam or any of the others would claim. Buddhism answers the question, what went wrong? It refuses the framing that most religions use. It doesn't say that the world is broken because man rebelled against God. It doesn't say suffering is a result of sin. It doesn't say that there was a fall from grace because grace assumes that there's a giver and a judge. So Buddhism starts completely with a different premise. Nothing went wrong in the universe as a moral event. That the universe is not morally ordered under a personal lawgiver. So the reality simply is that the problem is not that creation fell. The problem is that you just see reality wrongly and you cling to what you see. So Buddhism goes right back to where it began. Life involves suffering. Not only pain, but dissatisfaction. And it's a restlessness that never quite goes away. That feeling that even when you get what you want, it doesn't last. It's the fact that pleasure fades, youth fades, strength fades, people die, plans collapse. The mind will just not stay quiet. You can win and you'll still feel hollow. You can lose and be ruined. Either way, you cannot keep control. And Buddhism says that's not an accident. That is just built into the human condition as long as you relate to reality the way you currently do. So what went wrong? Buddhism answers it with two linked claims. First is that you crave. And second, you don't see clearly. You crave because you want pleasure, you want security, you want comfort, you want control, and you want permanence. You want life to hold still. And it's because you crave something that you cannot keep. And you don't see it clearly because you treat impermanent things like they're permanent. You treat the self as though it's solid. You treat the body as though it's reliable. You treat relationships as though they're guaranteed. And you treat feelings as truth. And you treat the world like it owes you stability. And so then you cling to those things, and then this clinging produces suffering. Now, that's why Buddhism appealed to my atheism, because it diagnosed the suffering without ever invoking God. It didn't say that suffering exists because you offended the holy judge. It says suffering exists because your mind is attached to illusions. And atheist philosophy almost says the same thing, even if it uses different language. It says you suffer because your expectations exceed reality. You suffer because you resist what you can't control. You suffer because you attach your identity to outcomes. You suffer because your mind is conditioned by instinct and fear. And that overlap is real. And so Buddhism felt like a structured version of what a secular mind already suspects. So it wasn't preaching. It was just observing. And it was saying, look at your own experience. Look at what craving does to you. And then Buddhism goes even further with this basic self-help, because it doesn't just say that craving causes problems. It says that craving is the engine of the entire cycle of suffering. It says you want, and then you grasp, and you fear losing what you grasp, and then you suffer when you lose it, and then you want it again. And so even the desire to avoid suffering becomes part of the trap, because it just becomes another craving. It becomes something else to desire. So in Buddhism, what went wrong is not a single event. It's a pattern. It's a cycle that just keeps repeating because of the way the human mind relates to reality. And there's another part to this that matters, and it ties directly to the view of man, just as we've covered, that the self is not permanent. And a lot of suffering comes from defending an identity that's not stable. And pride is fragile because it depends on a self-image that can be threatened. Envy is painful because it depends on comparison. Anger arises because the ego feels attacked. And resentment grows because the ego thinks it deserves something else. So Buddhism says you can trace much of your inner misery back to the demand that the world confirm yourself. And Buddhism calls that demand the root problem. Stop demanding permanence from impermanence. Stop demanding control over what changes. Stop demanding that reality honor your cravings. That's the diagnosis. So here's where Buddhism is both insightful and it's also limited. It's insightful because it describes something very true about ordinary human suffering. If you cling too tightly, you will suffer more. If you attach your happiness to what can be taken away, you will live in fear. If you build your identity on your status, your job, your comfort, your reputation, you will be unstable because those things are unstable. And anybody who's lived a little bit knows that. But Buddhism also turned that into a universal explanation. And that is where the tension starts to begin. Because not all suffering comes from craving in the way that Buddhism tries to frame it. Some suffering actually comes from love. Not from any sort of selfish grasping. A man suffers when his child is sick. Not because he's clinging to some fantasy of pleasure, but because love binds him to that child. Or a man suffers when a friend dies. Not because he misunderstood impermanence in any way, but because friendships are real and loss is real. And Buddhism will always interpret that suffering through attachment. And in one sense, I guess it is correct. Love does attach you. Love does bind you. Love also makes you vulnerable. But the question is whether that attachment is a defect to be removed, or is it a reality to be honored? And Buddhism tends to treat attachment as the problem across the board. It doesn't easily distinguish between attachments that are disordered and attachments that are morally noble. And again, that overlaps with atheism, because atheism treats suffering as something to manage and minimize. It doesn't give suffering any sort of moral purpose. It doesn't say anything about suffering being redemptive. It says suffering is just an unfortunate side effect of being alive. And if you can reduce it, reduce it. Buddhism is a lot more disciplined in that because it often ends in the same practical aim. It says to reduce the suffering by altering your relationship to desire. So that means what went wrong becomes this. You live as if temporary things can satisfy you permanently. And you live as though the self is solid. You live as if control is possible. You live as if craving will bring you peace. But because reality does not cooperate, you suffer. So Buddhism's not saying stop wanting those things in a shallow way. It's saying your entire orientation is wrong, that you're even facing the wrong direction. You're reaching for something that cannot hold you. So the core problem is not moral guilt. It's ignorance, and it's just misperception. And so that sets up the next question with perfect logic. If the problem is ignorance and craving, then the solution will not be forgiveness. It won't be grace. It won't even be reconciliation with God. The solution is a method. It's a path. It's just a discipline that removes the craving and it corrects the perception. So how's it fixed? If the problem is ignorance and craving, then the fix in Buddhism follows with very cold clarity. You do not get saved. You get trained. You don't get forgiven. You get awakened. And you don't reconcile with any kind of a personal God. You just detach from the cravings that keep you bound. And that reason is why Buddhism appealed to me. Because it didn't require a savior. It didn't require any form of revelation. It didn't ask me to kneel before any kind of a judge. It just asked me to observe reality, discipline myself, and walk a path. And if the path works, it works. So what's the fix? Buddhism lays out a cure that's both moral and psychological, but it's not moral in the sense of obedience to a divine law. It's moral in the sense of actions that reduce suffering for yourself and others. It's like therapy, but it's deeper than therapy. It's a system of liberation through detachment. And the basic structure of it looks like this. You recognize suffering, you identify the cause of the suffering, you accept that there's a way out, and you walk the way out. That's just the method. And Buddhism fills that method with discipline, especially the practice often being grouped under the path of right understanding, right intention, right speech, right actions, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Now, you can call that list religious, and you can call it philosophical. You can even call it psychological training, but either way, the point's the same. If you reshape the mind and the will until the craving loosens its grip, the fix is not external, it's internal. And that's where Buddhism and atheism often start to sound almost identical in tone. Atheism says no one is coming. You got to master it yourself. And Buddhism says no one can do this for you. You must walk the path. Atheism says your mind is conditioned by biology and experience, so retrain it. And Buddhism says your mind is trapped by ignorance and craving, so retrain it. Again, the results sound similar. Less reactivity, less attachment, less fear, less anger, less craving, and therefore less suffering. But Buddhism's not merely aiming at being calm, it aims at liberation. Its goal is to end that cycle. Many people today treat Buddhism like it's basically a self-help package. They borrow mindfulness, they borrow the breathing, they borrow the language of being present, but then they'll stop right there. In classic Buddhism, it goes even further. The end goal in Buddhism is nirvana, and nirvana is not a place you go to enjoy anything. It's not heaven, it's not communion, it's not any sort of a fulfillment in any kind of a personal sense. It is the extinguishing of the fire. The fire is craving, the fire is attachment, the fire is grasping at the self and the world, and nirvana is the end of that fire. And that's why Buddhism can sound to a Western ear like it aims at nothingness. It speaks in terms of cessation, that the stopping of the craving, the stopping of the suffering, the stopping of the cycle. So how's it fixed? When you stop clinging, when you stop craving, when you stop mistaking yourself for something that's permanent. It's fixed when you stop reaching for permanence in a world built on impermanence. And the way you do that is by discipline. Mindfulness, not some kind of relaxation trick, but as a way to observe the mind without being owned by it. It's meditation, not as a hobby, but as a tool to weaken compulsive cravings. Moral restraint because certain acts inflame the craving and they harm others. Right speech because the tongue can lie, it can manipulate, it can ignite hatred. Right livelihood because how you live shapes who you become. At the time, I respected that. And to be fair, I still respect the discipline. Because Buddhism doesn't tell you to feel spiritual. It tells you to do the work. And that will resonate with anybody who understands training. It is not sentimental. It's not built on emotion. It is built on practice. But here's where that tension will come right back. And this is where my experience in Iraq eventually made these questions impossible to ignore. If the highest good is the reduction of suffering, then the best life is the one that avoids cost. So if the solution is detachment, then love becomes a liability because love attaches you. So if the solution is extinguishing the desire, then sacrifice becomes strange because sacrifice, it demands desire for the good of another. We've talked about this. Love is not love. Love is sacrifice. And that's willing the good of another over the good of self. So if the solution is escape from the cycle, then courage becomes secondary because courage normally means suffering for someone else. And Buddhism can interpret those things, but it often interprets them as attachments that have to be purified away. So the fix becomes a release from this personal. You loosen the bonds, you stop the grasping, you stop the craving. You stop insisting that life has to go your way. And in doing so, you become less vulnerable. And that's real. But then comes the question that Buddhism will struggle to answer in a way that satisfies any conscience. What about evil? Not my personal little irritations, not my anxiety, not my cravings. Evil. A man who chooses to murder children is not suffering because he wanted a nicer house. He is choosing evil. He's not trapped in misunderstanding. He is willing himself towards the destruction of others. Now, Buddhism can respond to that by saying he's ignorant and he's trapped in craving. And in one sense, that's true, but that doesn't weigh the act out. It doesn't speak with any kind of force that the human conscience demands when it gets confronted with deliberate cruelty. And to be fair, atheism has the same problem. Because if there's no judge, then all you have is technique. And if there's no moral law that binds reality, then the best you can do is just reduce the suffering and manage the behavior. Now, you can call acts harmful and you can call them unskillful, but you cannot say that they're evil in the strongest sense because evil implies that there's a moral order that stands above the human opinion. And so Buddhism offers a fix that can be powerful for the inner turmoil of a person. You train the mind, you detach from the craving, you extinguish the fire, you end the suffering. But when life confronts you with chosen evil, the fix can start to feel like an answer to a different question. It fixes anxiety, it fixes restlessness, it fixes the misery of craving. But it never fully answers why the conscious demands judgment when the cruelty shows itself. And that's where Buddhism began to feel to me like atheism was just discipline. It was impressive, it was useful, but ultimately it was silent on the deepest moral weight of the world. And so this notion that all religions are the same, they collapse under these questions. Because by the time you work through these systems honestly, the claim that every religion is the same stops sounding generous and it starts sounding lazy. People say it because it feels polite. It sounds like it lowers the conflict somehow. It lets everybody keep their preference and then still claim truth. But once you apply these questions, the claim cannot survive. And not because I want it to fail, but because these answers are not remotely the same. If religions were truly the same, then when you ask these foundational questions, you would get roughly the same core answers, maybe with a different vocabulary. But that's not what happens. These questions expose those differences fast. Who is God? Who is man? What went wrong? And how's it fixed? And when you put Buddhism under that light, you don't get a variation of Islam, and you don't get a variation of Judaism. You don't get a variation of Hinduism. You get a different map of reality. Buddhism does not begin with a creator. It doesn't rest on revelation. The Buddha does not claim to be God. Buddhism sets the God question aside and treats it as though it's unnecessary. That alone separates it from religions that claim that God speaks, that God commands, and God judges. Buddhism doesn't define a man as an immortal soul accountable to a judge. It treats the self as unstable. It shifts the problem from guilt to ignorance. And it shifts the fix from forgiveness to discipline. Buddhism says that the root problem is craving and misperception. It says suffering is the result of clinging to impermanent things. And it just offers a path of detachment aimed at ending the cycle. That is not the same religion as one that says that the root problem is rebellion against God. It's not the same as one that says you will answer to a judge. It's not the same as one that says salvation comes from God acting in history. And it's not just Buddhism. This is what the series keeps showing over and over again, episode after episode. Each system answers these questions differently and not with minor differences. These are contradictory differences. Some of them say God is personal. Some say God is impersonal. Some say God is irrelevant. Some say man is a soul. Some say the self is illusion. Some say evil is sin. Some say evil is ignorance. Some dissolve evil into imbalance. Some say the fix is obedience. Some say the fix is enlightenment. Some say the fix is ritual. Some say the fix is detachment. Those answers cannot all be true at the same time. If God is personal and a judge, then God is not an impersonal force. If man has a soul, then man is not merely a temporary bundle with no enduring self. If evil is rebellion, then evil is not just misunderstanding. If salvation is reconciliation with God, then salvation is not self-extinguishing detachment. So when someone says, and I don't care if it's a priest, I don't care if it's a bishop, I don't even care if it's the Pope, when they say that all religions are the same, then what they're actually saying is one of two things. Either they haven't examined them closely, or they don't want to tell you the truth. But these 4 questions will force examination. They don't let you hide behind vague language. They don't let you pretend that contradictions are just different perspectives. They force each system to say what it actually claims. And Buddhism is a perfect example. Buddhism can be disciplined. It can be insightful. It can reduce the inner turmoil, but it does not give you a creator. It does not give you a judge. It does not give you a moral accounting. It doesn't even give you redemption. It just gives you a path of detachment aimed at ending the craving and ending the suffering. And that's not the same destination as religions that speak of God and judgment and salvation. So the claim collapses. And not because I hate the claim, but because it cannot stand up to scrutiny. Once you work through all of these systems honestly, you're going to be left with a choice. Either truth is real and contradictory claims have to be weighed, or truth is personal and then religion becomes preference. So the questions do not let you stay neutral. These questions force you to decide whether reality has an answer or whether you're just collecting coping mechanisms. And that's why we keep going. So next week, we will focus on Zoroastrianism and the questions. Zoroastrianism comes out of the ancient world with a blunt claim that good and evil stand in real opposition, that the world is not only suffering, that the world is conflict, that the human will matters, and that your choices matter. And history is not just cycles repeating. History moves towards an end where good must win, or else nothing makes sense. So next week, we will put Zoroastrianism up against the questions. Who is God? And is God one? Who is man? And what is that man accountable for? What went wrong? And why evil feels personal? And how's it fixed? And whether that fix is victory or merely balance. So Zoroastrianism is also not the end of the road, but it's a necessary turn because it forces the evil question into the open. And it doesn't let you dissolve into psychology. It doesn't let you shrink into discomfort. It names it as something real. So if you want to be honest, you have to deal with that because you've all lived lives through the kind of evil that doesn't fit into polite explanations. Now, before we close, I'm going to speak to you plainly here. If you want truth, you can't shop for what feels peaceful. You must submit your mind and your will to what is real. And that begins with humility. Humility is not self-hatred. Humility is just an agreement with reality. You've asked these questions because your soul refuses to accept slogans. But don't let that search become another way to stay in control. So We're asking these questions because our soul refuses to accept slogans, and that's good. But don't let the search become another way to stay in control. So the work we have for this week is to pray daily. Even if it feels dry to you, just give God 10 minutes. Ask for light. Ask for courage to accept truth when it costs you. Then examine your conscience every night. Write it down. Just name the sin. Name the excuse that you used. And ask for mercy. Also, practice custody of the eyes and the tongue. Now, many men lose the fight right here and then pretend like the rest of it is complicated, but it's not that complicated. And then fast in some small way, some steady way. Just pick one comfort you have and deny it. Do that quietly, because you need discipline if you want clarity. And look, remember this. Any religion that cannot judge evil cannot heal you. It can only soothe you. And while soothing can have a place, it cannot carry the weight of a human life. You were made for more than coping. You were made for truth, even when the truth wounds your pride. So keep asking the questions. Don't rush. Don't perform and don't pretend. Just ask them as a person who intends to obey the answer once you find it. And next week we will take up Zoroastrianism, and we will face the problem of evil head on. May God bless you all. In nomine Patri, Filii, Spiritui Sancti. Amen.
Thank you for listening to Veritate. If you would like to contact the show, please email us at veritate@yahoo.com. That's veritate@yahoo.com. Thanks again, and we look forward to hearing from you. May God bless you all.